This program examines the period from 1763 to 1775, discussing the transformation of the American colonies from loyal provinces of the British Empire into states of open revolution. It's January 1763, the date shown on the bottom right. The monarch is King George III, shown below the date. The Prime Minister, abbreviated here as PM in January 1763, is John Stuart. The Prime Minister in this final stage of British colonial America is critical. While George is the king, it's actually through Parliament that taxes will be passed, so the Prime Minister and Parliament is of central importance. In February 1763, the French and Indian War is officially over. The Long War, which was essentially a world war, has come at an astronomical cost for the British Empire. Following peace with France, Britain's post-war debt is more than 140 million pounds in 1763 currency, the equivalent of many, many billions today. By 1763, Britain's tax revenues are consumed with paying off the national debt while also maintaining the regular costs necessary for managing the empire. Back in the mother country, citizens living in the British Isles are already heavily taxed, and Parliament does not want to increase taxes in the homeland any higher than they already are. In 1763, citizens on the British Isles paid about 50 times the taxes as American colonists, despite the fact the Crown had protected those American colonies during the recent war. The cost to protect the frontier in the American colonies was measured in the hundreds of thousands of pounds each year. In London, from Parliament's perspective, it makes logical sense to apply taxes in America that are already being applied at home on the British Isles. We will zoom back into the colonies. April 1763. George Grenville becomes the first Lord of Treasury in Britain. His administration will focus on recouping the costs of the French and Indian War. Britain will move to refund its war debt. The most logical starting point is the enforcement of customs duties for Atlantic trade goods. The Royal Navy is granted authority to enforce the customs duties. The number of British warships increases in American ports. May 1763. The Ottawa chief Pontiac begins a pan-Indian uprising against the British forts, and the western frontier is again under attack. Summer 1763. Western forts in the Great Lakes Territory fall to native warriors, but forts Pitt, Detroit, and Niagara hold strong. Once again, as in the French and Indian War, settlers living in the backcountry of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland are facing Indian attacks. But Britain is countering the uprising. The empire posts thousands of redcoats on the western frontier. October 1763. King George III issues the Proclamation of 1763, an effort to end the conflict between the British and the natives. White settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains is forbidden. George wants to consolidate his American holdings, and his focus is on ending hostilities, establishing formal boundaries in Britain's new lands in Canada and Florida, and replenishing the national debt from the war against France. November 1763. Geoffrey Amherst, Commander-in-Chief of British North America and one of Britain's most decisive generals of the French and Indian War, is recalled to Britain. He is replaced by Thomas Gage, a general who George Washington had served with during the French and Indian War. December 1763. There is more violence to come between settlers and natives. On Pennsylvania's western settlements near the Appalachian Mountains, where many western settlers had been killed and displaced by Pontiac's rebellion, men from Paxton Township in Pennsylvania kill innocent Native Americans near Conestoga, Pennsylvania. The Paxton Boys threaten wider violence. Hundreds of these backcountry Pennsylvanians plan to descend on Philadelphia, but Benjamin Franklin is able to meet with the Paxton leaders and quell the rebellion. The Pennsylvania Assembly agrees to provide western counties with more representation in the colonial assembly, and frontier defenses would also be improved. This violence in Pennsylvania between white settlers and natives, along with the further arming of the frontier, finalized the end of William Penn's peaceable Quaker kingdom. 1763 comes to an end. Spring 1764. A combination of His Majesty's troops on the frontier, renewed trade and gift-giving between British and native communities, and the removal of many white settlers from beyond the mountains has lessened native attacks in the back country. Native warriors are ready for peace. So Pontiac's rebellion quiets with negotiations, and many British statesmen note that trade and talk are more fruitful than force. During Pontiac's rebellion, British regulars had done the lion's share of the frontier defense. In the late spring and early summer of 1763, it made sense to many that the empire would provide defense for her colonies and in return ask for compensation for the associated costs. However, maintaining a large standing army in North America to keep that peace will come at a cost of some 300,000 pounds per year. April 1764. George Grenville, Prime Minister and Parliament, strategizes to mitigate the empire's debt by improving revenues from America. We will zoom out to get a wider view of the transatlantic economy. The citizens living in the British Isles are already paying higher taxes for the empire. Grenville does not want to increase the tax burden there. Instead, he will streamline age-old navigation acts, which are custom duties in American ports. Thus, in April 1764, Parliament adopts the Sugar Act. It's called the Sugar Act because the most important commodity taxed is molasses, or refined sugar, one of the most profitable trade items in the Americas. The Sugar Act will actually lower taxes on imported molasses from the West Indies. However, it also provisioned for more enforcement of the tax. Rum distillers and sugar refineries in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island are hit with duties. Colonial assemblies up and down the seaboard believe that their authority as the representation for taxation has been overruled. Petitions are sent to Parliament. Assemblies in New York and North Carolina communicate to Parliament that the Sugar Act is unconstitutional, referring to their right within the British Constitution. Now, the Sugar Act started soon after the French Indian War had ended, meaning that the new tax was levied just as the war economy bottomed out. Thus, many merchants suddenly had fewer customers, while they are also facing tightly enforced duties. While much of the Sugar Act was similar to other mercantile customs, Prime Minister Grenville appointed custom agents who actually enforced the laws. This was not the first time that custom duties were imposed on colonial ports. The Navigation Acts had been in effect for 100 years, following the Restoration-era policies of the 1660s. However, the difference with previous custom taxes and the Sugar Act was that Grenville would vigorously enforce the taxes. Clandestine trade with French, Dutch, Spanish, and other foreign nations was also prohibited. Grenville also proposed that violators and smugglers were to be tried not locally in the colonies, but in Halifax by a court of the Vice Admiralty, where verdicts were decided by a judge, not a local colonial jury. Many colonists felt that their right to a trial by jury was now infringed. In addition to the Sugar Act, Parliament also passes a Revenue Act on cloth and leather goods. On the one hand, the empire is in crippling debt and needs revenue. On the other hand, these measures are hitting merchants right during the post-war economic downturn. We will zoom back into the colonies. In July 1764, the empire is assuming a wider and more formal responsibility in communication with native nations. William Johnson and John Stuart are appointed as Britain's agents with the natives. 1764 comes to an end. It's now spring 1765. British civilization is now maturing into the first industrial revolution. The empire's markets are global. American colonial exports to the mother country are valued at 1.5 million pounds in 1765, while Britain's goods imported into America are valued at 2 million pounds. New industrial products, like fine ceramics that had previously only been available to royalty, are now marketable to average consumers. Companies like Wedgwood are making these former luxury products available to a wider audience. America's ports are growing with this blossoming trade. Port cities like Baltimore, Maryland, and Norfolk, Virginia are becoming major centers of trade. The rise of American port trade means that regular farmers are now gaining access to a transatlantic market for their crops. This new economic reality means that more Americans are financially independent, and their economic freedom means that they are more confident to speak their minds. May 1765. Word reaches North America that Parliament has passed a Stamp Act in order to pay for the North American defense. Also in May, the Quartering Act requires colonists to house and supply British redcoats on the frontier. From the vantage point of London, this only seems logical and fair, as the British Army is protecting the colonial frontier, and it is really only the settlements at the edges of the empire in the newly acquired areas of Florida and Canada, as well as along the Appalachian Mountains, that would be affected by this quartering measure. From Parliament's view, all that is being asked is that the colonies help house and supply the soldiers that are protecting their borders. New York City serves as the arrival port for the Army, a staging point from which the armies will then be deployed to the frontier forts. It's in New York City that trouble is brewing over the Quartering Act. The public's displeasure with the presence of redcoats will soon reach the New York Assembly. Meanwhile, the Stamp Act is set to go into effect later that year in November. The Stamp Act is a tax on all paper documents, and it gets its name from the posting of a stamp on those documents. Thus, legal documents, books, newspapers, and other paper documents are subject to the tax. Grenville and Parliament did not anticipate the controversy that would erupt with the Stamp Act, as the Stamp Act was in effect in the mother country for generations back on the British Isles. Grenville meant for the Stamp Act to pay for colonial defense, so it only made sense to him and Parliament that America would help with the paying of their own defense. However, because the Stamp Act taxes those that use paper products, professions of means like lawyers, newspaper printers, clergy, politicians are all affected. So Parliament alienates professional classes in America. While Britain has imposed duties on imports for generations, the Stamp Act is the first time Parliament imposed a tax internally within the colonies. Also in May, the same month that word reaches America that the Stamp Act is passed, the House of Burgesses in Virginia resolves that only Virginia's representation can tax Virginia. The Stamp Act isn't even in effect yet, but it has caused turmoil in the colonial assemblies. Patrick Henry emerges as one of the loudest voices in the House of Burgesses, speaking against taxation without representation. Patrick Henry goes as far as motioning that citizens could refuse to pay these taxes. Henry states, "If this be treason, make the most of it." Americans are now arguing against taxation without representation, an argument the Irish had been making for generations. The House of Burgesses resolutions are printed and distributed in newspapers, further popularizing the concept of no taxation without representation. Let's zoom out and travel across the Atlantic to Britain. In London at Westminster Palace, it is argued that the colonies are in fact represented in Parliament, as Parliament considers the needs of the empire as a whole. On the British Isles at this time, cities like Manchester and Birmingham had no local representatives in Parliament, but these cities were considered virtually represented by other members of Parliament. Thus, from the British perspective, each member of Parliament represents the whole nation. However, Americans are increasingly interpreting representation to mean representatives from local regions. We will zoom back into America. Protests against the Stamp Act spread into summer. July 1765. Charles Watson Wentworth, Marquis of Rockingham, is now Prime Minister. The refusal of so many Americans to abide by the Stamp Act means that courthouses cannot process paper documents without the necessary affixed stamps. In addition, the riots, mobs, and demonstrations can't be stopped in port towns because the redcoats are posted on frontier forts. August 8, 1765. Massachusetts newspapers print the names of the stamp tax collectors. August 14. Mob violence ensues in Boston. The taxman Andrew Oliver's home is attacked by rioters led by Ebenezer McIntosh. Mob action by the Sons of Liberty, a vigilante group, spreads down the coast, occurring in Newport, Rhode Island, and Charleston, South Carolina. August 26. The home of Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, is attacked by a mob. September 1765. Sam Adams, a former tax collector, is now in the Massachusetts legislature, a vocal opponent of the Stamp Act. October 1765. 27 delegates from 9 colonies form the Stamp Act Congress, which meets in New York City. The Stamp Act Congress affirms the resolutions passed by the House of Burgesses. On the one hand, the meeting concludes that Americans are loyal subjects of Great Britain, but on the other hand, the Stamp Act Congress resolves that only colonial assemblies have the authority to tax citizens within the colonies. British North America has dozens of colonies stretching from the Caribbean to Canada. The Stamp Act Congress contained delegates from 9 of these colonies. It's the middle colonies between the Caribbean and Canada that are emerging as the most resolute and organized in their opposition to taxation. In certain colonies, like Virginia and North Carolina, the governor refuses the legislature to participate. October 31, 1765. It's the day before the Stamp Act goes into effect. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty intimidate the taxman Andrew Oliver. Oliver resigns his post. In New York City, an effigy of Lieutenant Governor Colden is burned. November 1765. In New York City, sailors and workers throw rocks at Fort George and attack the home of a British officer, Thomas James. By late 1765, there are regular demonstrations through New York City with residents chanting, "Liberty, Liberty." December 1765. In London, King George states, "I am more and more grieved at the accounts in America." 1765 comes to an end. January 1766. The New York Assembly refuses to follow the Quartering Act, and the city will not house or supply redcoats. March 1766. Parliament hears the anger from America as well as from British merchants, and the Stamp Act is repealed. Taxes on molasses are also lowered. However, Charles Watson Wentworth, Marquis of Rockingham, passes a declaratory act which reaffirms the authority of Parliament. July 1766. William Pitt, Earl of Chatham, is now Prime Minister. 1766 comes to an end. June 1767. The Townsend Acts are passed. These acts are named after Prime Minister William Pitt's financial minister, Charles Townsend, and these acts taxed imported goods like glass, paint, paper, and tea. Townsend realizes the Americans will not accept another new tax on internal goods, so he focuses on raising taxes on imports, as Britain has done for generations. While the Townsend Act will produce revenue for the empire, it is only a fraction of the monies needed to maintain the North American defenses. October 1767. In Boston, in response to the Townsend Acts, a boycott of imported goods ensues. November 1767. In Philadelphia, John Dickinson publishes Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, where he warns that the Townsend revenues will pay the empire's officials to manage the colonies. So instead of the colonies managing themselves with their own assemblies, Dickinson warns that the colonies would be managed by royal administrators paid for by taxes from Americans. Dickinson also contends that Parliament has no right to tax America. 1767 comes to an end. February 1768. In Boston, Sam Adams and the Massachusetts House of Representatives published letters called circulars to other colonial assemblies, voicing opposition to the Townsend Acts. In retaliation for its condemnation of the Townsend Acts, Massachusetts Governor Francis Bernard dissolves the Massachusetts Assembly. Following the dissolution of the Assembly, more civil unrest follows in Boston after the Assembly is dissolved. But Massachusetts residents turn to a social custom derived from their Puritan heritage, the town meeting. March 1768. Town meetings in Boston adopt more strict boycotts, further restricting British imports. Instead of importing goods from Britain, Bostonians turn to what they call homespun, or homemade goods. The Daughters of Liberty form, and they spin homemade goods. Boston's non-importation stance spreads to other colonies. American artisans support the boycotts, as the market is no longer flooded with British goods. Non-importation quickly grinds the transatlantic trade to a halt. British exports to America are halved, crushing British industrial output and closing factories. June 1768. In Boston, a British warship seizes John Hancock's ship, which was called the Liberty. Riots ensue. Boston is again in a state of social unrest. We will zoom out to the wider Atlantic world. In response, redcoats board ships in Nova Scotia and Cork, Ireland, their course set for Boston. British warships are en route to Boston. But in Boston, Sam Adams is not standing down. He organizes town meetings to decry the incoming military occupation. We will zoom back into the colonies. October 1768. Augustus Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Grafton, is now Prime Minister. Redcoat regiments have arrived in Boston. Extra-legal town meetings and conventions are dispersed. Boston is now occupied by British forces. 1768 comes to an end. As 1769 begins, Boston is an occupied city. 4,000 redcoats are in the city, meaning that about 1 in 4 people in town are occupying soldiers. Bostonians claim that the occupying soldiers commit theft and assault. February 1769. In Williamsburg, Virginia, the House of Burgesses resolves that the colonial assemblies have every right to communicate and organize, and that colonial assemblies, not Parliament, has the authority to levy taxes on the colonies. In retaliation, Virginia's Governor Berkeley dissolves the House of Burgesses. But the Burgesses simply relocate to the Raleigh Tavern at Williamsburg and adopt non-importation. Spring 1769. The colonies are also dealing with internal issues. New York and New Hampshire contest their boundaries. Ethan Allen forms the Green Mountain Boys to drive out New Yorkers from lands claimed by New Hampshire. In the Carolinas, there is conflict between the dominant Anglican ruling families in the eastern lowlands and the Scotch-Irish Presbyterian and Baptist settlers living in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Settlers in the western Carolina territories are often required to travel to the coast for courthouse licenses and documents. This also means that western territories have little recourse to try criminals with legal services so far away. With a vacuum in local government, Westerners in the Carolinas form a militia that they call the Regulators. In 1769, the South Carolina Assembly at Charleston responds to growing tension by creating new western districts with local courts and sheriffs, as well as more western representation in the South Carolina Assembly. So we can see that there is an internal revolution stirring here within the colonies themselves, between the big cities on the coast and the backcountry settlers who are now demanding more local control. July 1769. We will slide from the Atlantic coast westward to the Pacific coast. Spanish North America is expanding in the southwest. Father Junipero Serra founds a mission at the new Spanish post of San Diego. The future state of California is now part of the Spanish Empire. Let's slide back to the Atlantic coast. 1769 comes to an end. January 1770. A major riot erupts in New York City between redcoats and American militia. By 1770, women are holding spinning bees to create homespun clothing. Due to non-importation, British imports to northern colonies are down by more than half. The losses incurred from non-importation in America are greatly exceeding the revenues generated from the Townsend Acts. February 1770. Lord Frederick North is now Prime Minister. March 5, 1770. In Boston, British redcoats are waiting in line to find a second job at the docks. A tussle that starts with snowballs ends in musket shot. 5 citizens are killed. Paul Revere widely distributes this illustration of British redcoats firing on unarmed civilians. The Boston Massacre is discussed up and down the colonies. Meanwhile, British merchants are complaining that the boycotts caused by the Townsend Acts are destroying transatlantic trade, and they advocate for a repeal of the Townsend Acts. April 1770. Parliament hears the voices in America. They repeal the Townsend Acts, however the tax on tea will remain. Tempers cool, order returns. Redcoats are removed from Boston. With much of the duties removed, the boycotts end in Philadelphia, then New York follows. Finally, Boston ends its boycott. Normal trade resumes between the colonies and Britain. September 1770. The redcoats involved in the Boston Massacre are arraigned. In North Carolina, the grievances of Western settlers have not yet been remedied. Here, wealthy coastal families have bought much of the land in the West, driving out Western settlers. Westerners also believe that they are being unfairly taxed without adequate representation in the colonial assembly. In September 1770, the Western militia, the Regulators, attacked the courthouse in Hillsborough, North Carolina, assaulting court officials. The house of Edmund Fanning, an Orange County official, is destroyed. In response, the North Carolina Assembly takes a middle position. On the one hand, the violent actions by the Regulators will be met with lethal force. On the other hand, Westerners will obtain new districts with their own courts. October 1770. In Boston, Captain Preston, the officer involved in the Boston Massacre, is acquitted of murder. The lawyer defending the redcoats successfully argues that the redcoats were provoked to defending themselves, and the jury will find 7 of the 9 redcoats not guilty. This lawyer who defended the redcoats is John Adams. Meanwhile, George Washington has visited the region around Fort Pitt that he first made 17 years before. Washington has plans for these western lands, and he is confident that the King's Proclamation line, which forbids settlement beyond the mountains, is only temporary. In addition to hundreds of thousands of acres for the expansion of Virginia, Washington envisions a canal connecting the Potomac River to the Ohio River. December 1770. 2 soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre are found guilty of manslaughter. We will slide west to the Pacific coast. In 1770, Father Serra has established another mission in California, this one at Monterey. Monterey will serve as the capital for the Spanish in the region. Thus, the 1770s are critical in the history of both the East Coast and the West Coast. We will slide back to the Atlantic Ocean. 1770 comes to an end. May 1771. The Regulators in North Carolina are still not satisfied with the Assembly's concession to Western settlers. The vigilante militia plans to march on the capital at New Bern. Governor Tryon sends his militia to intercept the Regulators. Near modern Greensboro, North Carolina, a battle ensues at the Alamance River. 300 Regulators are killed and their leaders are hanged. The uprising is put down, but the Battle of Alamance shows that colonists are willing and able to organize militia against the state. Summer 1771. With the retraction of most of the Townsend duties in effect, boycotts have ended and trade between Britain and the American colonies is bustling again. Businessmen on both sides of the Atlantic are happy. 1771 comes to an end. June 1772. Governor Hutchinson in Massachusetts becomes a salaried official in the British government, as opposed to a public administrator paid by the colony of Massachusetts. He is, apparently, now accountable to London, not Massachusetts. On June 9th, in Providence, Rhode Island, colonists, angered by the crackdown on international trade, board the HMS Gaspee, a sail ship called a schooner. The officer of the Gaspee is wounded, and the ship is burned. This attack is against His Majesty's fleet, and the violators are liable to be sent back to England. Fear spreads through the colonies that accused criminals might now be sent back to Britain instead of being tried among their peers in their home colony. November 1772. In Boston, Sam Adams forms a committee of correspondence to open communication and resistance links with other colonies. December 1772. Yet more stirs in Boston. At the Second Baptist Church, Reverend John Allen delivers a sermon called An Oration on the Beauties of Liberty, which upholds the rights of Americans, attacks the British tyranny, and also opposes the slave trade. The sermon is widely distributed through the colonies. 1772 comes to an end. January 1773. Parliament investigates the arson on the HMS Gaspee. Colonists are alarmed that the accused may be sent away to trial in England. Also in January, Massachusetts Governor Hutchinson argues in favor of parliamentary authority at the Massachusetts General Court. March 1773. In Williamsburg, Virginia's House of Burgesses forms a committee of correspondence. The colonies are talking to each other. Let's zoom way out. On the other side of the world, the East India Company has an overabundance of tea. The East India Company is accountable to shareholders, and investors have seen their stock prices drop. Prime Minister Lord North wants to solve two problems. First, he will relieve the East India Company's oversupply of tea by making it available cheaply in America. Second, he will alleviate America's recent unrest over taxation by exempting the East India Company's inventory of certain tea duties. So the East India tea will not be subject to all the duties that other tea products are subject to. Essentially, the East India Company can legally undersell all other tea markets in America. May 1773. In London, Parliament passes the Tea Act to support the East India Company. Company ships are en route to America. We will zoom back into the colonies. December 1773. East India Company ships are arriving in American ports, filled with tea. Colonists are not buying into the East India Company's monopoly on tea. Up and down the coast, colonists demand that the East India tea is returned. However, Massachusetts Governor Hutchinson insists on selling the tea. The company's ships, the Beaver, the Dartmouth, and the Eleanor, enter Boston Harbor. December 16, 1773. The Sons of Liberty dress as Native American warriors. They board the tea ships and throw 342 cases of tea into Boston Harbor, a cargo valued at nearly 10,000 pounds, or about $4 million today. With a humorous flair, the stunt is called the Boston Tea Party. 1773 comes to an end. January 1774. We will zoom out to a transatlantic view. Back in London, King George and Prime Minister Lord North learn of the Boston Tea Party. From the perspective in London, the Boston Tea Party is outright vandalism against a publicly traded commodity, costing the equivalent of millions of dollars of damage to shareholders. Many of the shareholders are members of Parliament. leniency will no longer be granted. We will zoom back into the colonies. March 1774. In response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passes the first of the coercive acts. This first coercive act closes Boston Harbor until the city can repay the East India Company for damages. His Majesty's fleet will be dispatched to shut down the port. This coercive act and subsequent acts will be known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. In spring 1774, Fort Pitt, at the headwaters of the Ohio River, is again at the center of competition, except it is not between France and Britain, but rather between Virginia and Pennsylvania. While George Washington and Governor Dunmore see the Ohio country as Virginia, the Penn family has organized Fort Pitt as part of western Pennsylvania. Both colonies are already envisioning western expansion into the Ohio country, despite the King's proclamation forbidding expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. We will zoom out to get a transatlantic perspective. In London, Benjamin Franklin, having resided in England for many years, has decided to return to Philadelphia. He knows a conflict is brewing, and he has sided with the colonial patriots. His son, William, is governor of New Jersey. Governor William Franklin will remain loyal to His Majesty. We will zoom back into the colonies. May 1774. Parliament passes the Massachusetts Government Act and the Administration of Justice Act. These acts are punitive to Massachusetts. Massachusetts' charter is replaced, town meetings are restricted, and redcoats will be lodged in unoccupied buildings inside town, in accord with the new Quartering Act. The British general, Thomas Gage, is made governor of Massachusetts. Thomas Gage had served with George Washington during the French and Indian War, and they had both been at Braddock's defeat 19 years before. Thomas Gage will bring 4,000 redcoats to occupy Boston. On May 24, the House of Burgesses in Virginia motions to support Boston. In retaliation, Governor Dunmore of Virginia dissolves the House of Burgesses, but the representatives simply relocate to a nearby tavern. June 1774. British warships are arriving in Boston. The Empire shuts down Boston Harbor. Thomas Gage's redcoats are occupying the city. The coercive acts are in effect. However, food and supplies are sent to Boston from the other colonies. Also in June, Parliament passes the Quebec Act, allowing Frenchmen in Canada to practice Roman Catholicism, a sweeping change in religious toleration for the British Empire. The Quebec Act also extends the colony of Quebec down to the Ohio River. This essentially allows the French and the Indians to resume much of their lives as they had been before the French and Indian War. The Quebec Act, however, inflames anti-Catholic feelings within the colonies because several colonies now feel that French Catholic Quebec has annexed their western land speculations. So ironically, London is gaining Old French Canada while losing British America. July 1774. In Virginia, Thomas Jefferson publishes A Summary View of the Rights of British America, where Jefferson argues that the American colonies are free and independent. September 5th, 1774. The First Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia at Carpenter's Hall. The First Continental Congress is composed of 55 delegates from 12 colonies, from Massachusetts in the north to South Carolina in the south. Georgia, Florida, and the Canadian colonies do not send delegates. John Adams, Sam Adams, George Washington, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, Benjamin Franklin, and others are present. These delegates had been chosen by the colonial assemblies. Several of these assemblies had been disbanded but had reformed independently to send delegates to Philadelphia. The Continental Congress endorses the Suffolk Resolves, which had been delivered from Massachusetts to Philadelphia by Paul Revere. The Suffolk Resolves encouraged colonists to resist the Intolerable Acts, to refuse to pay the objectionable taxes, and to begin training militia. The First Continental Congress will not just be an advisory council or a gathering for communications. They have assumed real authority, and they will codify and enforce that authority. The Continental Congress forms a Continental Association, which enforces a full boycott of all British wares, including goods that have already arrived in American warehouses. Any British goods that are stored in warehouses are not to be circulated. Those who violate non-importation will have their names posted in the newspapers. Non-importation is set to come into effect in December. The Continental Congress also creates a Committee of Safety, which forms new American political organizations independent of the British government. In Massachusetts, the Committee of Safety oversees the militia, which are now called Minutemen, a reference to their ability to organize within a moment. Let's zoom out to the other side of the Atlantic. Also in September, Lord North proposes that Britain may add soldiers from Hessen in Germany in the event that the situation in America progresses to an open war. We will zoom back to the colonies. October 1774. The First Continental Congress adjourns in Philadelphia. However, the Congress decides to meet again in the spring if the situation is not resolved. Also in October, Thomas Gage dissolves the Massachusetts legislature. Gage realizes he is isolated in Boston. Across the countryside, important offices like sheriffs and judges are now loyal to the Continental Congress. In Virginia, George Washington is organizing militia. Meanwhile, Lord Dunmore of Virginia is also on the move in October, making a western land grab for Virginia. He moves Virginia militia against the Shawnee in the Ohio country, clashing with the natives at Point Pleasant in modern West Virginia. Virginia is exercising its authority in the Ohio country in violation of the King's proclamation. December 1774. At Portsmouth, New Hampshire, cannon from Fort William and Mary are commandeered by independent militia. We will zoom out to the wider Atlantic world. Non-importation, enforced by the Continental Congress, is now in effect. Transatlantic trade shuts down. 1774 comes to an end. We will zoom back into the colonies. January 1775. In Boston, Thomas Gage, increasingly isolated, is quite aware of the widespread opposition to the mother country. He recommends that the intolerable acts are repealed. Back in London, there is another key British authority that sees the writing on the wall. An elder statesman in Parliament, William Pitt, the man who had 20 years before changed the course of the French and Indian War for Britain's favor, demands that Parliament reopen Boston and remove all redcoats from the city. He even motions for Parliament to accept the Continental Congress as a legitimate lawful entity. However, William Pitt's proposals are defeated. Instead, London is putting General Gage under pressure to solve the problem in Boston. But Gage knows the Massachusetts population has turned on him and British authority in general. He is surrounded, fully aware that he does not have the manpower to enforce royal authority. We will zoom out to the transatlantic perspective. In February 1775, Parliament votes to declare Massachusetts in a state of rebellion against the Empire. One of the members of the House of Commons who voted for this measure was the scholar Edward Gibbon, author of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Spring 1775. Back in America, thousands of Americans from all social and economic backgrounds are now serving in extra-legal committees and assemblies outside of the British political system. This new American identity is crossing over ethnic boundaries. For instance, many German Pennsylvanians are now part of the new militias. On the other side of the Atlantic, Brown Bess muskets, cannon, and powder are loaded by the ton onto ships, all marked for Boston. March 1775. In Virginia, Patrick Henry declares, "Give me liberty or give me death." April 1775. In Boston, under increasing pressure from London to find a solution to the growing trouble, General Gage makes a decision. It will be practically and politically challenging to arrest Continental leaders in Massachusetts. Instead of going after people, he will go after things. He will seize stockpiles of arms in Concord, Massachusetts, west of Boston. But General Gage's plans to seize rebel stockpiles in Concord is discovered. A member of the Sons of Liberty, Paul Revere, will ride west from Boston toward Concord to warn them there of the approaching redcoats.